Hi there, friends. It's nice to see you again, and welcome to our upload of our sharing with you on Philippine law. This is, of course, your dear friend, Dean Joe-Santos Balagtas Bisquera, who will bring you this time a very interesting subject matter. And this is in the area of political law, particularly the origin of the state and also how the Philippines came to be a state, a sovereign state. And so you will enjoy this particular slide because it goes back to the fundamentals on how we became the Philippines and how come you and I are Filipinos. Actually, I did enjoy recording this particular segment. I have always wanted to go back to the fundamentals of the Philippines, and therefore, this is a rare opportunity for me to share with you this beautiful thing. Actually, we're discussing the Philippine Constitution here, and we are following the order of the Supreme Court in scheduling the bar examination. In the first component of the discussion of the Constitution, it talks about the government itself, and the three branches of government, which is the legislative department represented by Congress, the executive department represented by the office of the president and the administrative staff that he has, and finally the Supreme Court, which represents the judiciary. Later on, we will also talk about the three constitutional bodies that will include the Commission on Election, the Civil Service Commission, and the Commission on Audit. But this particular portion that we will be talking about we will be touching on two very interesting topics in addition to the origin of how a state came to become recognized as such following the Montevideo Convention in Uruguay in 1933. And what is interesting here is since we will be focusing on the legislative department, Congress, and we will not finish all of it. We will have a second run on this one. But we will be discussing two very important things that I personally also was getting mixed up until I started making sure that what I will share with you is exactly the story of the first topic, which is the party list, and the second one is the so-called initiative and referendum. Well, for those of you who have not seen me for the past 3 months, I've been a little busy with the College of Law's examinations for the past 4 semesters, and also my active cases where we've been conducting hearings online also. And just for those of you who are seeing me for the first time, I come from three different disciplines. I come from the academic field. I come from the business world in business management. It's a very senior and very seasoned executive. And I come from the field of law. And so I don't want anymore to bore a lot of you. You can take a look at this when you find time. But let me click now these slides and see what we can share with each other. The first major discussion is, as you can see, it says the state under the Montevideo Doctrine. Very interesting, what is Montevideo and what does it represent? Sometime on December 26, 1933, a big group of countries gathered in the capital city of Montevideo, Uruguay. And they convened in order to come up with the Montevideo Convention, which is a treaty in international law which adopted the declaratory theory of statehood when the following elements are present. In effect, in today's political science, when we are asked whether a particular aggregation of people would already assume the personality of a state, then the Montevideo Convention or Doctrine established that in 1933 when a group of nations gathered to say that in order for a group of people occupying a territory can be declared a political state, a sovereign state, then the following should be present. So the elements of a state was defined in the Montevideo Convention, and the first element is that a state has to have people consisting of a permanent population. And obviously, one of the more interesting subject matter here would be, of course, the recent takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Much earlier than that, after the Second World War, is Israel, which continues to fight for its survival in the middle of the Muslim Arab countries. And so people would be the first element. The second element is that a state to be such will have to have a defined territory. And that is why through the action of the United Nations, Israel was given a territory that the Palestinians continue to dispute as their own. Third element is that that particular group of people occupying a territory must have organized a government that runs their affairs. And finally, the concept of sovereignty, which is its capacity to enter into relations with other states. Now, this one can be a little ticklish because in political science, they divided sovereignty into what is called the external sovereignty and the internal sovereignty. When the real political science foundation for sovereignty is what is provided in the Montevideo Convention, which is a group of people with a territory, with a functioning government, would have the fourth element of statehood if it has sovereignty, meaning it has the capacity to enter into relations with other countries. That is why you will notice when the Taliban of Afghanistan took initiative and they took over Kabul, the capital, somewhere along the line, the People's Republic of China immediately recognized the Taliban as the government that runs Afghanistan now, a different Muslim state. On the other hand, the reason why I brought up this sovereignty is while the concept of external sovereignty is the capacity of a state to interact, to establish relationship with other sovereign states. There is also the concept called internal sovereignty, where you have the government and the government has laws. And the capacity, the capability of this government to ask their people, their citizenry, the people under their territory to follow and observe and respect the law is what has been termed in political science as internal sovereignty. No. So among ourselves, when we talk about sovereignty, we're really referring to the Montevideo Convention's idea of sovereignty, which is the capability of a state to interface, to enter into treaties, into agreements with other sovereign states. But other political scientists would bring in the second component of internal sovereignty, which I discussed with you a while ago. Continuing now, the highlights of the Montevideo Doctrine, in addition to coming up with the four elements of a state, which is people, territory, government, and sovereignty, included some of the beautiful concepts in political law and political science. The first one is the countries which attended and gave their initial ratification. These were the first countries that attended the convention in Montevideo and affixed their signature to the Montevideo Treaty or Convention are the following. And you will notice a number of them are from Latin America. And since I have been watching a number of Netflix movies involving the prohibited drug cartels that focused on a lot of states in Latin America, I am reminded now that in 1933, when they probably did not yet have all of this cocaine and shabu and marijuana, take a look at the countries that attended the Montevideo Convention. Number one is Brazil, and then Chile, Colombia, very interesting, Costa Rica, and then you have Cuba, you have the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, the United States of America, and Venezuela. If you will notice, most of these countries are in the Latin American hemisphere. And there is not any country coming from Asia. You don't see Indonesia, you don't see Malaysia. At that time, it was still Malaya. You don't see China and Russia. In Europe, absent are the predominant countries like France and Germany and Switzerland and Spain and Portugal. So these were the starters of what is called the Montevideo Doctrine. Some of the principles that evolved in that particular convention is that one, the political existence of a state is independent of recognition by the other states. Even before recognition, the state has the right to defend its integrity and independence, to provide for its conservation and prosperity, and consequently to organize itself as it sees fit, to legislate upon its interests, administer its services, and to define the jurisdiction and competence of its courts. The exercise of these rights has no other limitation than the exercise of the rights of other states according to international law. My dear friends, since we are talking here of a doctrine spearheaded by the United States of America in 1933, it would be very interesting for us to go back to our history, to the history of our country, and where were we in 1933. You will remember that we revolted against Spain and we almost succeeded in overthrowing already and taking over Manila. In the 1998, with the revolution in 1996, 97, and in 1998, we have all the features that are mentioned here. And so when President Diosdado Macapagal in effect changed the independence of the Philippines from July 4, 1946 and retroacted it to June 12, 1898, that is an accurate accounting of our statehood following the very convention that the United States led. And yet, the United States was here, entered a sovereign country like the Philippines and occupied our country, and took over our own independence and sovereignty. As a matter of fact, we are talking here of Christian Philippines. If we go back to our Muslim brothers in Mindanao, they'll say, "You are the only ones who surrendered to the Americans. We never did. We never surrendered to the Spaniards. We never surrendered to the Americans. We never gave up against the Japanese. And so we are the true independent state Muslims of Mindanao." And so in all candidness, I do empathize and I do appreciate the independence of the Muslim Filipinos because in the true sense of the word, they stood in defending the very sovereignty of this country and they were never invaded. And so we happen to be Christians only by accident of the invasion of the Spaniards headed by Legazpi, but they never conquered Muslim Mindanao. And so we should probably give our Muslim brothers in Mindanao that kind of respect and recognition. And so the creation of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao is probably the least that we can give by way of respect to our Muslim Filipinos. Continuing now with the Montevideo Doctrine, and let me just make this a little smaller now by bringing it down. It says here that the primary interest of states is the conservation of peace. Differences of any nature which arise between them should be settled by recognized pacific methods. Beautifully said in 1933 because it was at that time that Hitler was starting to flex his muscles to finally start World War II in Europe. And Japan, of course, was also mobilizing its industrial military complex, not to mention Italy, the Axis powers that brought the world into the Second World War. They were talking about peace and Pacific methods in 1933, and yet all of them went to war in the late 1930s and the 40s. Continuing now, the Montevideo Doctrine also stated that the states do not recognize, take note of this, the states, meaning the signatories, do not recognize territorial acquisitions or special advantages which have been obtained by force, consisting in the employment of arms, in threatening diplomatic representations, or effective coercive measure. The territory of a state is inviolable and may not be the object of military occupation nor of other measures of force imposed by another state directly or indirectly. And yet we have seen the story of the Second World War when you see the big industrialized nations warring against each other to dominate, for example, the rest of Asia. And at the same time also with Hitler's regime to conquer and occupy most of Europe, even reaching the boundaries of Russia, except that Russia launched its own defensive move. Continuing now, it's the Montevideo Doctrine said that, let me just make this a little smaller, says that no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another state. The jurisdiction of states within the limits of national territory applies to all inhabitants. Nationals and foreigners are under the same protection of the law and the national authorities, and the foreigners may not claim rights all other than or more extensive than those of the nationals. You will take note, 1933, they were already talking about how massive the domination of big countries are over evolving countries that have just acquired their independence. And so here is a beautiful component of our country, the Philippines. And there is our Philippine flag, a flag that we always love. I remember as an elementary student at Pio del Pilar Elementary School in Santa Mesa, Manila, I enjoyed, the flag ceremony because I was the one who was personally, tying the knot of the flag. And when the teacher starts, her beating, Bayang Magiliw, I would be the one to personally, pull that particular rope so that I can see the Philippine flag flying. And so my love for this country started when I was a very little boy raising the Philippine flag. And I will never ever be ashamed to be a Filipino. And I have traveled so many places outside of this country. And even if I probably do not look more Filipino, more typical Filipino than most of you, I have always proudly said, whenever I'm asked whether are you Chinese, are you Japanese, are you Korean, so, and I said, no, 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 I am a Filipino. And I will always, there were even times I would put a little Philippine flag on my lapel, even when I was not a member or I was not connected with the government. Because to my mind, I am entitled to carry my Philippine flag on my lapel because I am a citizen of the Republic of the Philippines. And perhaps some of my own high school classmates were saying, many of them, about 70% of them from University of Santo Tomas Education High School, are now in the U.S. fully settled. But they always say, Joe, anytime that you want to come to the United States, even at your late age, you will still make good here. And I said, no way, man. I love my country. I was born in this country. I made good, I think, as a Filipino. I am not a multimillionaire, but I am not a poor person in the Philippines. And I reared my family here. And I continue to be a happy and proud Filipino. And I will probably be happy to die and be buried in Philippine soil. In your case, I said, even if you are now American citizens, you are still brown, you are still colored, you are still discriminated upon. And when a white American would look down on you and shout at you, you cower in fear, in inferiority, because you know you can never be a true American. But nobody can do that to you if you are in Philippine soil, even today. And they said, but here in the Philippines, many people carry guns and, they can threaten you with guns. But it is even worse in the United States because you do not control guns under the law of the United States. You are entitled to arm yourself. But here in the Philippines, we do control guns. But if anybody threatens you with a handgun, then get your own handgun. And if there is a shooting and you are the innocent party but you were just defending yourself, you have here a good friend whose title is Attorney Joe-Santos Balagtas Bisquera to defend you here in the soil of your birth, the Philippines. Okay? So, if we continue now, and let us now use the Montevideo Doctrine, the Philippines is a sovereign state because we have people. We have now 111 million Filipinos based on the latest count. We have that territory on the left, the lands that our forebears, our earlier settlers settled, from Indonesia and Malaya to establish the brown race here in these 2,100 islands called now the Philippines. And so we have the element of people, 111 million now. We have the 2,100 islands. And on this side, we are being contested by the People's Republic of China under their 9-dash line, while we invoke the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to define our territorial boundary and our economic zone. And we have our sovereignty because we get we are a respected nation worldwide. We are recognized. And our medals in the Olympics further amplify the Republic of the Philippines. And with the birth of a nation with people, territory, sovereignty, automatically with government, there is what is called the sovereign power. The inherent power of a state is automatically given birth with the creation of the nation, where the Philippines now exercises its inherent power of police power, eminent domain, and taxation. And the people effectively, when they were being asked to surrender their sovereign will to their agent, the government, the people said, we will only surrender our sovereign authority and power provided we enter into a contract. We enter into an agreement. We enter in a very sacred document or a covenant called our Constitution. And so this will define the rights of the people as the sovereign element of the state in relation to the government that they are creating as their agent of to serve them. And so, with the element of people, territory, sovereignty, and government organized under a written constitution, on three or four occasions, the constitution has been rewritten. And so now we have a document where the sovereign people and its delegated government has an agreement on what to observe in the relationship. And so the sovereign people now, therefore, invoking their sovereign will and ensuring that their inviolable human rights are contained in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, establish the Constitution in order to define how the sovereign will, how the sovereign power will be distributed among the elements of government. And following the principle of checks and balances, our people created the portion of the Constitution that defines what government they wish to have to serve them. And so they divided their sovereign power into three elements. The first element, the legislative power, they gave to the Congress of the Philippines. The executive power, they handed to the President of the Republic. And the third one, the judicial power, they entrusted to the Supreme Court in the exercise of judicial power. And so, take a look at how beautiful the skin of the Philippines as a sovereign state has evolved. My dear friends, to be honest about it, I have dreamed of creating this beautiful scenario, if only to show every Filipino this is how your country has been politically organized. And this is how we function as a state. You know, presidents, vice presidents, senators, and congressmen, mayors, governors, they will come and go. But the Republic of the Philippines, our sovereign state that we love, will exist because of this schematic description. And I'm giving this to you as a way of you're constantly reminding yourself where we are coming from as a sovereign state. This will be a permanent feature here in Google's YouTube, and you can go back to this no matter where you'll be in the future, and no matter how many years would you have already earned or has transpired from the time you watch this particular upload. At marami pong salamat for giving me this rare opportunity to show you my own mental set on how my country is organized. The country I love so much, the country that you love so much, the only country that we have and we will be continuing to be proud of. 111 million Filipinos and still growing at the rate of a little over 2% per year. And so, since we already mentioned a while ago that the sovereign will has been handed to the government as the agency of the people to take care of their welfare under the principle of salus populi est suprema lex. No? The welfare of the people is the supreme law. And under that particular government of service to the people, the first component, the legislative power, has been handed to the Congress of the Philippines as the legislative department of our government. And so it is now our opportunity to take a look at the legislative department or Congress by way of this schematic outline. In this component of our discussion, we will discuss this legislative power, the scope and limitation of that power, and the principle of non-delegation of that legislative power and the exception to the non-delegation. We will speak about the two chambers of Congress, its composition and qualifications. And we will talk about the Senate, we will talk about the House of Representatives, the district representatives, and questions of apportionment and the party list system. Now, in the area of qualifications, I will move this to a second module of this presentation for the House of Representatives or for Congress. The following topics are also scheduled here: legislative privileges, inhibitions, and disqualifications. And this will be handled in the second module of the next upload. Then we talk about quorum and voting majorities. The following topics will be taken up in the next module after this first module on Congress. There will be a second module in the discussion of Congress and the legislative department, including the discipline of members, the process of lawmaking, the electoral tribunals and the commission on appointments, the nature and powers of the electoral tribunal and the commission on appointment, the powers of Congress such as legislative inquiries and oversight functions, the non-legislative functions such as informing function, and the power of impeachment, initiative, and referendum is the last topic, and we will take it up in this particular slide. So going back to our first tabulation, the legislative power, we're now ready to discuss this one, and after this one, we will take up this one in order to hit that party list topic. And so let us now talk about the legislative power. The legislative power has the scope defined on Section 1 of Article 6 of the Philippine Constitution. And the scope of the legislative power in the Constitution says, the legislative power shall be vested in the Congress of the Philippines, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, except to the extent reserved to the people by the provision on initiative and referendum. Congress is authorized to make laws, alter, and repeal them. And there has been some issue on what is called judicial legislation, when every now and then the Supreme Court is criticized for inventing certain decisions that seem to be in the form of a law. And the Supreme Court said, no, it is not our role to legislate. That is the role of Congress. Our role only is to interpret whether or not the laws enacted by Congress are consistent with the will of the people contained in the Constitution. Continuing now, the placement of legislative power defines the type of government a sovereign state wants. So, kung saan nilalagay yung legislative power will allow you to understand what kind or type of government is being organized. The legislative power is the supreme power within a civil state. And you will notice that while there is so much concentration of power on the President of the Philippines, in reality, the concept of where this country should go to is determined by the Congress of the Philippines because each senator and each congressman has been elected by the people. The individual congressmen were elected directly by the people to whom they are servicing, and the senators were elected at large in order to represent the desire of the people in their entirety. And so, looking into the legislative power now, the comparative legislation in government structures from one state to another can be looked upon in this way. In a monarchy, the legislative power is with a single person. And usually you can see that it's a monarchy or a king. And to a certain extent, for example, you can still have that in Brunei, where you have that Sultan of Brunei running his country from the point of view of exercising executive and legislative powers. And so you can see it is a monarchy in effect, a sultanate, because the power to legislate, the power to exercise the direction on policy making is with a single person. Now, that particular singular ruling can be inherited from father to son following the old tradition of monarchies. Or a monarch can also be elected, but the monarch exercises both executive, legislative and executive powers. Of course, some of you will smile. President Ferdinand Marcos was elected as president, but he invoked the 73 Constitution, which was patterned also from the 1935 Constitution, to declare martial law and arrogate upon himself not only the executive power that he was carrying with him by way of his having been elected as president, he also declared martial law and assumed the legislative power in one man. The second setup of legislative power is an oligarchy. So from monarchy, it can be an oligarchy because the legislative power is shared by a few selected persons. So this time they have created a little gang, probably of 3 or 4 or 5. But for as long as it is not controlled by one person in a monarchy, when there are more than one who determines the legislative direction, the aspiration of the group of people that they represent, they have only a few, then you have an oligarchy. And you will remember the very popular issue on oligarchy in the Philippines. Meaning there are only a few families that seem to control the entire republic of 111 million. And finally, the third structure is a democracy. A democracy is a setup where the people, the sovereign people, you and I, the Filipino people, retain the legislative power to ourselves. And by giving us the power and authority to elect our senators and congressmen and to kick them out if we don't want them, that means we continue to exercise the absolute authority to determine a national policy. And we are therefore a democracy because the legislative power has not been given up in an absolute sense by the people of the Philippines. What are the limitations of the legislative power? The first limitation is that the legislative power is for the preservation of society, the people. And I will even say that the legislative power is not only to preserve society, but to provide a better level of life, a better life for our people, to provide them with food, shelter, clothing, education, and the fundamentals of living in a humane environment. That is the nature of legislative power. It is almost like the power of an obligation, or the obligation exercised through legislative power. Again, papasok na naman yung paborito kong salus populi est suprema lex. The welfare of the people is the highest law, the supreme law. Society must follow the laws laid down by the legislative body under the concept of internal sovereignty. This was what I was referring to a while ago when I was discussing the Montevideo Doctrine and the component of sovereignty. The portion that political scientists refer to as internal sovereignty really refer to the need of the people themselves to follow the law. Because if legislative power continues to belong to them, the power to make laws in order to improve the welfare of the people, continues to belong to the people themselves through their senators and congressmen, and therefore they owe it to themselves to follow that law because that particular law came from them. One time, I was caught in a traffic light, and I have some people, younger people, who were riding with me, and they said, Attorney Bisquera, yellow pa naman, siguro pwede pa kayong tumawid at wala naman traffic eh. And I said, I will follow that particular traffic light. When it says red, that means stop. But attorney, nobody is watching naman eh. Why be afraid to just ignore the red light? I said, that red light is telling you that we are a sovereign people. Yan, ano lang yan kako, traffic light lang yan, no? Pero para maging kagalang-galang yan traffic light na yan, behind that is the law that says, pagka yan green, lahat tayo dapat tumuloy. At may portion naman naka-red, dapat tumigil. Pag tayo naman naka-red, susunod tayo, titigil tayo. Sino ang nagsabi nun? Batas. Sino ba ang gumawa ng batas? Yun o mga senador, mga congressman. Hindi, nagkataon lang. Sila lang ang binigyan natin ng trabaho. Yang traffic light na yan, ikaw, ako, lahat tayo naglagay dyan. Ba't hindi natin sinusunod? That is the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, whenever I see jeepney drivers, bus drivers, truck drivers, tricycle drivers not following, I get into a rebellious mood and saying, ano ba naman kayo mga kababayan? Tayo isang bayan, dapat tayo sama-sama, tayong gumawa ng batas na yan. Ba't hindi natin sinusunod? Pag hindi natin sinusunod yan, sino binabastos natin? Yang traffic light? Hindi. That is an inanimate object. Ang binabastos natin, ultimately, yung nagpalagay niyan na gumawa ng batas para sundin yan. Sino yun? Ang ating gobyerno? Hindi. Ang gobyerno natin, tayo naglagay dyan at tayo ang naglagay niyan. Kaya pag binastos natin yan, binabastos natin ang sarili natin. When we therefore face ourselves in the mirror and tell ourselves, ang pangit mo, that is exactly the parallelism of not following the law. That we are in effect insulting ourselves and not anybody else, not the police officer, not the the mayor, not the police the police force. We are insulting ourselves as the sovereign people. Kung minsan po nakakalungkot, bakit po hindi maintindihan ng ating mga kababayan na ganun ang magmahal sa ating bayan? That is patriotism in the most fundamental thing. And how many Filipinos love this country and can become patriotic by simply respecting the very law that they themselves as the sovereign people have put up. Pasensya na po kayo. Ganyan pong kababaw ang aking pagmamahal sa aking bayan. Ganyan po ang aking pag-intindi kung paano ako magiging patriotic Filipino. Kaya lang po, pagka tinignan natin ang ating mga kababayan, ilan po kaya sa kanila ang pwedeng sabihin na patriotic? We will no longer ask them to stand there before a firing squad in Luneta. We will no longer ask them to abandon their families and carry their bolos the way Andres Bonifacio and Antonio Luna have led the Filipino revolutionaries to fight the Spaniards and the foreigners. We will no longer ask them to be in the trenches of Bataan and Corridor to fight the enemies of the people. No, we are only asking our fellow men, our fellow Filipinos, igalang po natin at sundin natin ang ating pagiging sovereign people by respecting ourselves and following the law. Because if we do not follow the law, then we do not give respect to ourselves as a sovereign people. The legislation must govern by fixed promulgated established laws that apply equally to everyone. Yan ang sinasabing kung meron tayong batas, kung lahat tayo ay pantay-pantay na sovereign people, therefore pantay-pantay din tayong nagsabi ng batas na yan, pantay-pantay din tayong susunod sa batas na yan because we are equal as sovereign power of this country. Naalala ko po ang aking pinakamamahal na kaibigan, isang tao na medyo mas matandang hamak sa akin by way of a generation. Nagbibiruan nga kami, sabi ko, nagkakilala na ho tayo sa Mindiola. Nung kayo po ay nakatayo ng nakabantay at kami naman po'y sigaw ng sigaw, ibagsak, huwag matakot. Sabi ko, Mayor Lim, kayo po ay si General Alfredo Lim nung panahon na yon at kayong bumabatuta sa amin. At kami naman kako ang nagsasabing, ganito namin mahalin ang aming bayan, ba't nyo kami babatutain? Pero ngayon ho, sir, tumanda na rin po ako ng konti, nandiyan pa po kayo, magkakampi na tayo ngayon dito sa Senado, magtutulong-tulong na po tayo. At sa natawa si late Mayor at that time, Senator Alfredo Lim, sabi niya, Joe, hindi ko akalain ikaw pala yung isa sa mga binabatuta namin noon, alam namin mali ginagawa nyo. Pero ngayon, eto ka, kasama kita, katulong ka sa pagsisilbi sa ating bayan, sabi niya. Yan pala ang ibig nyo sabihin noon na mahal nyo ang bayan na ito, na tutulong kayo sa pagkakataon na kailangan kayo. Opo, sir. Kaya sabi niya, sama-sama na tayo ngayon magtutulong para paglingkuran ang ating bayan. And therefore, it was working with then Senator Alfredo Sioholim. Later on also helping him as Mayor of Manila when I heard him and sabi niya, the law applies to all. Otherwise, none at all. Medyo yung English, medyo Pilipinong-Pilipino at parang grammatically mali. Pero yung meaning, ang daling intindihin ng isang Pilipino. The law applies to all, otherwise none at all. Ang batas ay para sa lahat. Kung hindi susunod ang isa, hindi na lang yan para sa lahat. Yan ang natatandaan ko sa aking mahal na kaibigan, Alfredo Lim. Si Alfredo Lim po kasing edad halos ng aking ama. And yet, I had the opportunity to work with him. And true enough, he's not a perfect Filipino. He is not the most genius of Filipinos. Hindi po papantayan kay Ferdinand Marcos sa utak. Pero ang sinseridad po niya, ang kanyang kagustuhan na kumilos at magresponde para silbihan ng ating mga kababayan, hindi ko po makukwestiyon. And it was a privilege for me to have met him and worked with him even when he was already 80 years old and I was only on my 60. More than 20 years po ang tanda ni Alfredo Lim sa akin. Sana po kahit nawala na siya, marinig naman sana ng kaluluwa niya na hanggang ngayon, binabalik ko yung narinig kong sabi sa akin nung kanyang kaibigan na si Attorney Dito Garay Blas. Sabi sa akin, alam mo din Bisquera, mahal na mahal ka ni Mayor Fred Lim. Inuulit ko rin po ang aking pagpuri sa kanya. Mayor, mahal na mahal ko rin po kayo. And so, the law must be designed solely for the good of the people. And yung favorite ko, kaya paulit-ulit ko sinasabi, Salus Populi est Suprema Lex, the welfare of the people and the supreme law. Mga kaibigan, with your permission, yan pong Salus Populi et Suprema Lex, favorite expression ko po yan. Nung ako po'y matanda na, nung naging abogado, nung ako po'y gumraduate ng Bachelor of Laws, binibiro nga ako ng mga kaibigan ko, hindi ka pa palalaos. Dahil I graduated valedictorian, the oldest in the graduating class at UA Law in 1992, but also the top of the class and also cum laude with a bronze medal even when I did not know any of the professors. Yan po ang binitawan ko sa aking valedictory address. Sabi ko, one day when we become lawyers, remember, Salus Populi est Suprema Lex. The welfare of the people is the supreme law. Meron pa po naiwan doon sa ibaba. Itataas ko ng konti ito para makita natin. The legislature must not raise taxes on the people without the people's consent. Hindi ho pwedeng magkaroon sila ng batas para dagdagan ang ating taxes kung hindi natin gusto. Kaya lang po sa katotohanan, kung hindi naman tayo magbabayad ng taxes, no? Saan naman po kukuha yung mga ibinoto natin para naman po sila pagsilbihan ng tao? Of course, yung iba sa inyo magbibiro, din Bisquera, hindi naman ho lahat ng kinukuha nilang pera, ginagastos sila para sa tao. Yan po nasa personalan na yan po. Meron siguro talaga mga tao matitino, meron mga tao na hindi matino. Sana naman po lahat tayo na kung magkaroon ng pagkakataon, magsilbi sa ating bayan to the government. Kahit pumalit ang sweldo, sana man po wag na nating abusuhin ang pera ng tao. And so, continuing now, the legislative power, my dear friends, cannot be delegated under the principle of non-delegability of legislative power. And in the case of Rodrigo versus Sandiganbayan and Santiago versus Comelec, our Supreme Court had the opportunity to say that the people delegated its sovereign power to enact laws to Congress. So, itong tayong mga sovereign people ang nagbigay ng karapatan, nagbigay ng power, ng lakas sa ating Kongreso na gumawa ng mga batas. In the same way as to implement these laws, we have delegated the sovereign power to implement the laws to the executive department, to the president. and to the Supreme Court to determine whether laws conform to the Constitution. And the principle of non-delegability says that what the people have delegated cannot be further delegated. No, under the Latin concept of potestas delegada non delegari potest. What has been delegated can no longer be further delegated. The doctrine, meaning non-delegability of legislative power, that the legislative power cannot be delegated, is based on the ethical principle that such delegated power constitutes not only a right, no? Hindi lang natin binigay sa kanila bilang karapatan nila nang gagaling sa ating sovereign people, but it is also a duty to be performed by the delegate by his own judgment, acting immediately, not through the intervening mind of another. This was an old decision in 1908 in the case of United States versus Marias. Ang sinasabi rito, binigyan na namin kayo ng power, ng lakas, no? Using our sovereign will to make laws. Hindi nyo na pwedeng hingin, no, na yung binigay namin sa inyong power, ibibigay nyo pa sa iba, sapagkat hindi lang karapatan yung binigay namin sa inyo yan, kung hindi obligasyon nyo, duty nyo na gawin yung aming pinagagawa sa inyo, sapagkat kami ang pinanggagalingan ng sovereign power at kami ang naglagay sa inyo sa inyong pwesto. Kaya kayo may obligasyon sa amin na sundin ang aming ibinigay na legislative power sa inyo. However, there are exceptions to the principle of non-delegability. Congress may delegate to another branch of the government the power to fill in the details in the execution, enforcement, or administration of a law. So, pwede pala, kung pinag-uusapan, pag-execute ng batas, yung pag-implement ng batas, yung pag-administer ng batas, maaaring hindi na alam ng detalye ng Kongreso. Basta yung prinsipyo ginawa niyang batas, sasabihin niya sa Executive Department, ikaw na mag-implement within the boundary of the law that we created. And so the exception to the principle of non-delegability is that to avoid a violation of the principle of separation of powers, that said law must be complete in itself. So kapag gumawa ang Kongreso ng batas, dapat kompleto yan. Setting the policy to be executed. Ano yung kagustuhan natin? Ilalagay dapat sa batas yan. Bakit natin ginagawa yung batas na? Carried out or implemented by the delegate. Second, the law fixes a standard. Merong criterion. Merong checkpoint. The limits are sufficiently determinate or determinable, to which the delegate must conform in the performance of his functions. And this is in the case where Republic Act 6758, the Compensation and Position Classification Act of 1989, where the principle of non-delegability was defined. Doon ang ganda-ganda ng kaso eh. Kasi po, nung ginawa yung jurisdiction ng Sandiganbayan, marami pong nilagay na position doon. Nagkaroon ng catch-all na yun daw grade level 27 and above covered by that particular jurisdiction of the Sandiganbayan. Pwede kang maparusahan by the Sandiganbayan trying you with the ombudsman prosecuting you. Nagkaroon ng issue ngayon yung isang mayor. Yung isang mayor, hinabla siya for graft and corruption. Kinestyon niya ngayon. Sabi niya, teka muna. Under the principle na pag gumawa ka ng listahan, yung listahan niya exclusive na lang yan. No? Merong Latin term yan na ginagamit na kapag ka nilista dyan, yung hindi nakalista, hindi kasama rin sa batas. No? Exclusio unius, exclusio ulterius. Okay. Sabi niya, Gumawa na listahan yung jurisdiction ng Sandiganbayan, hindi kasama ang mga mayor, di kailangan motion to dismiss ako. I-dismiss mo yung kaso ko kasi hindi naman ako nasama dyan. Pero ngayon, ang nangyari, doon sa paggawa ng jurisdiction, sabi, teka muna, ano nga bang classification mo? Basta hindi ako kasali sa mga ipoprosecute nyo. Sinabi rito grade 27 eh. O generic yun eh. Ikaw ba grade 27? Ewan ko, sabi nung mayor. Eto na ngayon. Bumalik sila ngayon do sa classification, no? Yung Compensation and Position Classification Act under Republic Act 758. Doon, i-delegate doon sa Department of Budget and Management kung sino pa yung mga posisyon na kasama sa grade 27. At doon, nasama yung mayor. So sabi sa mayor, mayor, pala yung grade level mo pala, grade 27 for purposes of you're getting your pay. Kinukuha mo ba yung pay mo ang the grade 27? Oho. Sa Makatwid, may grade 27 ka. Oho. Sa Makatwid, kasama ka pala doon sa jurisdiction ng Sandiganbayan. Wala akong sa listahan o ng batas na ganyan Hindi. Nung ginawa yung batas na sinasabi kung sino yung covered the jurisdiction ng Sandiganbayan, binigyan din ng authority ng batas na yung DBM pwede niyang i-determine anong position classification ang mga posisyon na hindi nasama dyan. Binigyan siya ng ganong authority. No? Ang standard grade 27. No? So gagawin lang ng DBM, i-implement niya. Ito ba si Mayor grade 27 ba ito? Sa discretion ng DBM, following the standards, grade 27 ka. Ergo, kung grade 27 ka, pag tinatanggap mo sweldo mo under the DBM guideline, grade 27 ka rin pagka ikaw pinrosecute ng Sandiganbayan. Kaya ngayon, under ka sa amin, may jurisdiction ka sa amin. That is how the principle of non-delegability was implemented under the concept of the jurisdiction of the Sandiganbayan in relation to Republic Act 6758, where the classification of certain positions have been delegated to the Department of Budget and Management. We have already covered the legislative power, scope, and limitations. We are now ready to go to the second category chambers of Congress, composition and qualifications. We will talk about the Senate and we will talk about the House of Representatives so that we can cover now the party list system, a subject matter that is very interesting for all of us to understand. Okay, simulan natin ngayon. Under the legislative power now, we talk about the chambers of Congress, and the first chamber is the upper house or called the Senate. In the Constitution, Section 2, Article 6, it says the Senate shall be composed of 24 senators who shall be elected at large by the qualified voters of the Philippines as may be provided by law. Bago tayo nag-convene, nilista ko lang yung population ng Pilipinas daw as of this week. Sabi ng census, based on their projection, mga 111 million na tayong Filipinos. Dati 100 million, nasisindak na tayo. Ngayon 111 million, growing at about 2.3% per year. Ngayon, ilan doon ang boboto? Ang estimate ng COMELEC, the ones that will vote for this next presidential election was about 55 million Filipinos. Yan, 55 million. Yun ang bumoboto para sa Senado. Now, qualifications of a senator. Yung mga gusto maging senador. Sabi ng Section 3, Article 6, no person shall be a senator unless he is a natural-born citizen of the Philippines and on the day of the election is at least 35 years of age, able to read and write, a registered voter, and a resident of the Philippines for not less than 2 years immediately preceding the day of the election. Ayan, to summarize, Dapat daw natural-born Filipino citizen. Dapat 35 years old on the day of the election. Election ha, not on the day of the proclamation. Second, able to read and write, a registered voter, and a resident of the Philippines for not less than 2 years immediately preceding the day of the election. The senator's term of office. The term of office of the senator shall be 6 years and shall commence unless otherwise provided by law at noon on the 30th day of June next following their election. No senator shall serve for more than 2 consecutive terms. Pwede palang 2 terms pero hindi lang magkasunod, 2 consecutive terms. Voluntary renunciation of the office for any length of time shall not be considered as an interruption of the continuity of his service for the full term of which he was elected. So, if there is a senator, no, and he already served for 6 years on his first term, and then he served another 6 years, he was re-elected. Eh, nung ika-fifth year niya, sabi niya, gusto ko pa tumakbo ng third term, gagawin ko ngayon, magre-resign ako, hindi ko na kumpleto yung 6 years, hindi dapat counted sa akin yung 2 consecutive terms. The Supreme Court, the Constitution says, if he voluntarily voluntary renunciation of his office for any time, shall not be considered an interruption of the continuity of service. So, kung yung second 6 years niya, nag-serve lang siya ng 2 years, 4 years ang nawala, counted pa rin for purposes of the consecutive 2 terms, yung 4 years na umalis siya. Kung talagang pipilosopuin mo, let's say yung second 6 years siya, nag-absent na siya, nagpaalam na siya, may letter of resignation siya sa Senate President, no? On the week or on the month of the 6th year, sasabihin niya, hindi ko natapos yung aking 6 years second term, pwede na akong kumandidato for the third term and that will not be counted as third term. Hindi raw pwede yun under Section 4, Article 6 of the Constitution. Let me go back to this particular thing because I should not have clicked that because there is another component of that one, and that is the House of Representatives, the second chamber. The question is the House of Representatives composed of congressmen? In terms of the district representatives and the questions of apportionment, ilan ho ba dapat ang mga congressman sa Congress of the Philippines, no? If we read Section 5, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution, Article 6, it says, the House of Representatives shall be composed of no more than 250 members unless otherwise fixed by law. Yan. So, nung unang-unang gawin po ang Kongreso under the 1987 Constitution, they were only 250. But the same Constitution provided a colatilla or an additional feature that says that the Congress can fix by enacting a law how many more should they be. And now, based on the latest count of and based on the existing law that was enacted by Congress, there are now 304 districts. From the original 250, there are now 304 districts who shall be elected from legislative districts apportioned among the provinces, cities, and the metropolitan area Manila in accordance with the number of the respective inhabitants, and on the basis of a uniform and progressive ratio, and those who, as provided by law, shall be elected through a party system of registered national, regional, and sectoral parties of organizations. Dito po pumapasok therefore, no, yung membership ng Kongreso. If you become keen about what was mentioned in the law, Ang sinasabi dito, there are two kinds of memberships in the House of Representatives. The congressmen or representatives coming from the legislative districts, no, and those that are coming from the party list system. Ano ba itong party list system as designed by the Constitution of 1987? The party list representative shall constitute, according to Section 5, Paragraph 2 of Article 6 of the Constitution. It says, the party list representatives shall constitute 20% to 20% of 250 or 50 initially of the total number of representatives, including those under the party list. So for 3 consecutive terms after the ratification of this Constitution, one half, no, 50% times 50, no, yung 50 ito yun yung 20% of the 250 ang 20% noon is 50, no. Ngayon kalahati noon is 25, no? And it continuing to read, one half of the seats allocated to party list representatives shall be filled as provided by law by selection or election from the following, segments, and such other sectors as may be provided by law except the religious sector. Ito po ibig sabihin to, mga kaibigan. For 3 consecutive terms, dahil yung term nila, ilang term nila, they're supposed to serve for 3 years. No? So, ang sabi rito, 3 consecutive terms from the 1987 Constitution, no? Magbibilang ka ng 3 terms or 9 years. 9 years after the Constitution of 1987 was in place, no, within that 9-year period, dapat, no, 25 party list representatives should come from the labor sector, the peasant sector, the urban poor, the indigenous cultural communities, the women, and the youth. O, yun ang usapan, na yung unang 9 na taon, dapat 25 noon manggagaling dito sa mga sectors na ito. Minimum dapat maiboto itong mga ito at uupo sila. At yung iba, all other types of party list representatives that will be voted upon by the people. Now, continuing now, dapat ito unang lumabas, pero nauna ito, pasensya na lang. But let us now, as if rewind natin. Under this, each legislative district shall comprise, as far as practicable, contiguous, compact, and adjacent territory. Each city, with a population of at least 250,000, no, or each province, shall have at least 1 representative. No? So, kailangan yung isang province dapat may congressman. Ngayon, yung bawat city, no, dapat daw na may population na 250,000, dapat meron ding isang congressman. When I was a student, the city of Manila has 4 districts, no? District 1, which is Tondo, District 2, which is Binondo, District 3, which is Sampaloc, Santa Mesa, and then District 4, yung Santa Ana, Pandacan, yan, yung 4 na yan, ang distrito ng Maynila. When I came back, helping Mayor Lim, nagulat ako. Ang Manila pala, hindi na 4 districts, 6 na distrito na. No, 6 na distrito. And so, nagkahati-hati, but yung Tondo area, pinakamalaki is continues to be District 1. Yung Sampaloc, hindi na District 3, naging District 4 na. Yan. Now, what is really very funny is when I looked at the election noong panahon ni Isko Moreno, ang pinakamalaking distrito sa Maynila with 1 congressman is District 1, which is Tondo. Ang population na bumoto ron, registered, voted, baka naman may ramang hindi bumoto, is 160,000, which is less than this 250,000. So medyo kulang sila, pero binigyan sila ng 1 district dahil yung distrito na nakatayo na. District 2 is 95,000, District 3 is 96. Surprisingly, no, ang mga lumaki, yung Sampaloc, Santa Mesa and Pandacan area, Sampaloc is now 105. Maliit pa rin against the 250. Ang Santa Mesa area is 130,000. Taman Pandacan dyan siguro. And then 107 dun sa naiiwan dyan sa tawag dito sa Malate, Ermita, yung mga ganun. Okay. Ang ibig sabihin nito, every district should have one representative. And every city with 250,000 inhabitants should have one congressman. Siguro in-anticipate na. Because right now, there are now 304 districts, congressmen. And of this 304, no, pag i-divide mo yan by 5, sa bawat 4 na congressman, dapat merong isang party list representative. So ratio of 4:1. 4 na elected representatives direct by the people in the districts at isa elected to the party list system. Yan. Yan ang ratio. So ngayon, 304 sila. So kung i-divide mo yan by what you call this by ilan mangyayari dito. Kung hahatiin mo yan by 5, divided by 5, 304 divided by 5, that's about 60, no? About 60 will come from the party list, no? Kasi pag dinivide mo by 5, sa bawat 4, isa dapat representative, so dinivide mo by 5. So about from 50, naging 60 na ngayon yung party list representative. Kaya marami na rin kumakandidato na party list congressman. Now, continuing. The party list representative shall constitute 20% o times 250 or 50 under the original provision of the 1987 Constitution. Now, the party list group receiving, ito mekanismo on how party lists are elected. The party list group receiving at least 2% of the total votes for the party list get 1 seat each. Sa Makatid, maraming mga party list na nagpa-recognize sa COMELEC, no? Now, hinihingi nila yung mga botante, pag bumoto, wag lang yung congressman nila iboto, bumoto rin ng party list. So, for example, bumoto for the youth, no? Lahat ng mga partido, ng mga party list, titingnan, no? I-add lahat yung nila, no? Lahat ng mga bumoto sa kanila, no? There is say 200 party list sila. Lahat sila may boto. Isa lang naman ang pwede mo iboto ang party list eh. So, aadin lahat yon mga boto na binigay sa party list. Tapos titingnan, magkano yung boto, for example, ng Raha Matanda party list. No? Kung yun nakuha niya, 2% of the total, entitled siya isang party list congressman. Yan. Pagkatapos, yung susunod na another 2,000, another 1 delegate, at yung pangatlong 2%, magkakaroon ng 3. Maximum na 3 lang bawat party list group. No? And so those with more than 2% votes get to have additional seats in proportion to the total number of votes. Yun ang talagang rule. In practice, ang ginagawa nila, first 2%, isang party list representative. Second 2%, another one. And then third 2%, another one. And so you have a maximum of 3 party list congressmen per party. Yan. That was decided in the case of Barangay Association for National Advancement and Transparency, Banat versus COMELEC. A decision in 2009 headed by the then Chief Justice Artemio Panganiban. Kaya lang, nagkaroon ng reversal yan after 20 years. Just recently, nagkaroon ng decision ng Supreme Court penned by no less than Antonio Carpio of West Philippine Sea fame. Ang sabi nila, nung una, ang sabi ng under this particular Banat versus COMELEC, ang sabi nila, yung mga party list, reserved lang daw yan doon sa mga sectors na marginalized. In the latest decision of the Supreme Court, sabi, wala namang ganong intention eh. Yung intention lang, yung first 3 terms ng Congress, ng Constitution. After that, Basta ikaw qualified under this guideline na ibibigay natin, pwede kang kumandidato na party list kahit na ikaw hindi, marginalized. So let's take a look. What are the qualifications for the party list system? Number one, national parties or organizations, regional parties or organizations, and sectoral parties or organizations could participate in the party list elections. So national organization, regional organization, sectoral organization can participate in party list elections. Second, national parties or organizations and regional parties or organizations, take note, do not need to organize along sectoral lines and do not need to represent any marginalized and underrepresented sector. Wala na yan, tinanggal na yan. Hindi na mandatory you will be standing for the senior citizen. Hindi na mandatory tatayo ka para sa youth. Hindi na mandatory tatayo ka sa mga, for example, mga LGBT. No? Wala nang ganun requirement. Basta ikaw national organization ka o regional organization ka at you have really shown that you are an organized party list, pwede ka na ngayong kumandidato by registering with the COMELEC. Number 3, ito medyo maraming ingay. Political parties can participate in party list election. So pwede na PDP laban, pwede na Nationalista Party, pwede na yung Liberal Party. No? So political parties can participate in party list elections provided they register under the party list system and do not field candidates in legislative district elections. Kung hindi sila sasali doon sa district election, pwede silang lumaban doon sa party list. No? Ganyan ang ginagawa ni Mayor Atienza. No? Hindi siya sumasali doon sa ibobotong congressman, kundi sumasali siya as party list. Now, there is a note. A political party, whether or not it fields candidates in the legislative district election, can participate in party list elections only through its sectoral wing that can separately register under the party list system. O ito, ang ganda dito setup na ito. Even if you are pala a political party, it doesn't make a difference whether or not you're participating in the legislative district election. For as long as meron kang sectoral wing within your political party that you will separately register with the party list. So yung PDP laban, pwede niya i-register na political party siya participating in the what do you call this legislative district election. Pero magtatayo siya for example ng isang sectoral wing para ron sa mga disabled or para sa mga veterans. Yun under PDP laban pero meron silang sectoral wing. Yun magre-rehistro separately. No? PDP laban, for example, disabled veterans. Hiba yun. No? Pwede raw pareho yun tumakbo. So the sectoral wing is by itself an independent party and is linked to a political party through a coalition. So pwede pala nagko-coalesce ka sa party. Kasi merong mutual help yun eh. Yung mga followers ng party list pwedeng tumulong doon sa district candidate, no, legislative candidate, and vice versa. Continuing, sectoral parties or organizations may either be marginalized or underrepresented or lacking in well-defined political constituencies. It is enough that their principal advocacy pertains to the special interests and concerns of the sector. The sectors that are marginalized and underrepresented include labor, peasant, fisherfolk, urban poor, indigenous cultural communities, handicapped, veterans, and overseas workers. So yan, in-enumerate na yung tinatawag na marginalized that you will be encouraged also to set up your party list. No? And the sectors that lack well-defined political constituencies include professionals, the elderly, the women, and the youth. Dapat nilagay na dito, no, yung lesbian, bakla, and so on, kasama yun. Wala naman silang direct constituency. Number 5, guideline for qualification for a party list. A majority of the members of the sectoral parties or organization that represent the marginalized and underrepresented must belong to the marginalized or underrepresented sector that they represent. Siyempre, kung ikaw tumatakbong kandidato ng LGBT, dapat bakla ka o kaya tomboy ka, di ba? Similarly, a majority of the members of the sectoral parties or organization that lack well-defined political constituencies must belong to the sector that they represent. For example, pwede magtayo yung mga CPAs no, ng isang sectoral party under PICPA, and they should be CPAs. No? They should belong to that organization or professional group. The nominees of either sector must either belong to their respective sectors or must have a track record of advocacy. And 6th guideline, under the qualifications for a party list system, national, regional, and sectoral parties or organizations shall not be disqualified if some of their nominees are disqualified. So, meron kang ni-nominate, no? First, second, and third option, not disqualify. It does not disqualify the national, regional, or sectoral parties, provided that they have at least one nominee who remains qualified. Dapat yung mga ni-nominate mo, no, yung tatlo, isa man lang dun sana qualified. No? Now, this was the guideline given by the Supreme Court to reverse the Banat versus Comelec case of 2009, spearheaded by then Chief Justice Artemio Panganiban. This is now a later version decided in a series of cases headed by Atong Paglaom versus Comelec in April of 2013. Bagong-bago, mga kaibigan. And so therefore, those are the basic guidelines. Finally, ito na yung ating patapos na pagsasama-sama, initiative and referendum. Hindi naman masyadong complicated ito. The initiative and referendum does not fall under the legislative department chapter of the Constitution. It comes in the amendments or revision of the Constitution under Section 2, Article 17. And it reads, amendments to this Constitution may likewise be directly proposed by the people through initiative upon a petition of at least 12% of the total number of registered voters. So kung let's say 50 million tayo, 55 million, 20% at 12% ano. So 10% ng 55 is 5.5 million. Pagkatapos dagdagan mo lang ng another 2% yun, no? 1% is 500. Mga siguro, kung 55, 10% is 5 million. Mga 6 million ang dapat magkaroon ng boto, no? A petition for initiative. Okay. Of which every legislative district, ito pa may qualification, titingnan mo bawat district. And bawat district should at least have 3% of the registered votings within the district signing in for the petition for initiative, no, to amend the Constitution. Now, what is initiative? No? Initiative is the power of the people to propose amendments to the Constitution under Republic Act 6735 or to enact legislation through an election called for the purpose. Okay. And then, what are the three systems of initiative? The initiatives can be applied on the Constitution by proposed amendments. Yun, setup na yun, 12%, and then bawat district should have 3% of the registered voters, no? Or you can propose laws or statutes for enactment by Congress, and you can also meddle with local ordinances and resolutions. Apparently dito sa local ordinances, it will not be calling for the 12% of the national registration. Probably if it applies to a province, it will be 12% of the registered voter per province, no? and then 3% of each legislative district within the province. Hindi malinaw yung Section 2, but if you apply fundamental concepts, bakit mo naman gustong i-propose, for example, in the city of Parañaque, na lahat ng mga bakla dito hindi pwedeng maglakad na naka-shorts, huhulihin. No. Ngayon, pag kami ganung proposal, 12% lang ng mga registered voters ng Parañaque ang magkakaroon ng petition for that legislation na i-adapt ng City Council ng Parañaque. No? Kasi ba't naman makikialam, for example, yung Maynila or yung Cebu, no, doon sa local ordinance na pinag-uusapan sa Parañaque. So the 12% should only be applied to the total registered voters of the locality where the local ordinance is relevant. Okay? Now, ano naman yung national referendum or regional referendum? All registered voters in the Philippines vote on the proposal in the initiative. They can either vote yes or no. So, for example, may amendment ang Constitution, proposed amendment. Hindi na dumaan yan sa Kongreso, either by a constituent assembly or meron magkakaroon ng constitutional convention. Hindi na. In-initiate na ngayon to amend the Constitution. Therefore, kapag yung initiative na yun na-approve ng lumabas na 12% at 3% per registered district, then magbobotohan na yes or no lang. Yun ang sinasabi dito. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that essentially ends up our first phase of the discussion of the Constitution and specifically the Legislative Department focusing on the party list and also on the initiative. We will have subsequent sessions on this particular topic because there are still additional subject matter under the Legislative Department. Hopefully, we will have another a part 2 of the Legislative Department so that we can cover all the provisions under the Congress. And after we do that, we will move to the Executive Department and probably also have 2 slides. But in the Executive Department, the Office of the President, we'll have a lot of very interesting topics there, like the declaration of martial law, or when the president is sick, what happens, and things like this. Very, very interesting for all of us. And so that therefore, mga kaibigan, nagpapasalamat po ako sa inyo. Many of you have been sending me comments. 3 buwan na kayo naghihintay. Pasensya na po kayo. I intend to again increase the momentum of my uploads. Ang dami po. Ito po political law pa lang ito. Sa political law, meron pong isang gusto kong i-upload na ready na pero hindi ko pa napapinalize yung PowerPoint presentation. And this has something to do with public international law. I'd like to give you a framework, no, para meron kayong idea ano ba yung fundamental concept na pinag-aawayan. Pagkatapos pupunta tayo kung ano yung application nitong concept na ito doon sa West Philippine Sea. Napakagandang topic, buong-buo na po. Pero maraming nagdidebate, ganito, yung 9-dash line ng China versus yung United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLA, labo-labo, no? Ano yung exclusive economic zone, ano yung continental shelf. Pag-uusapan po natin yon. Isa yon sa pinakamaganda under the subject matter of political law, no? Marami pa pong pag-uusapan. Yun din pong local government, that is also under political law, pag-uusapan din po natin, no? Yung po mga disciplining of government officials, no, under the Sandiganbayan, prosecution for graft and corruption, mapapasok po yon sa administrative law, no? Itong political law po, itong pundasyon ng lahat ng batas kasi it talks about the relationship of the citizen, tayo mga sovereign people in relation to our government, no? But this is only, the portion of the Constitution that refers to the governmental setup, no? Pinag-uusapan na natin yung legislative power. isusunod natin yung executive power. Pagkatapos yung legislative power, pagkatapos yung tatlong commissions, no? Constitutional commissions na napag-initan ngayon dahil nga dun sa report ng Commission on Audit, one of the constitutional commissions, no? Pero alam nyo, ito political law pala yung pinag-uusapan. Ang dami-dami rin natin pag-uusapan tungkol sa civil law. No? Sa civil law, ang gustong-gusto ko nang ilatag sa inyo, yung latag nung yung tinatawag natin na family tree. Pag sinabi mong first cousin kayo, yung ba equivalent do sa legal terminology second civil degree? Huwag kayong mag-aalala, no? Yung iba nahihirapan yan, ako idodrawing ko sa inyong dahan-dahan na matutuwa kayo, no? Mapapanood nyo, ang dali-dali lang palang intindihin na yung first cousin is second civil degree. Tuturo ko sa inyo yung link up nun. No? Pati yung, kasi, para mapag-usapan natin yung kailangan natin yung pag for example namatay yung tatay, namatay yung nanay, sino magmamana, no? Vertical upward or vertical downward or upward bago lang pumasok yung nasa side, no? Kaya hindi mo mapapag-usapan kung sino yung magmamana under succession kung hindi mo na iintindihan yung family tree. Now, isang application yon sa civil law. Civil law kasi yung topic ng family code at yung mga ganong succession. Pero for example, pag pinag-usapan natin yung family code, ano yung mga void marriages, yung gano'n, meron doon mga incestuous marriages na pag-uusapan, pwede ba mag-asawa yung, for example, second degree cousin. Kung sasabihin yes or no, hindi mo naman naiintindihan kung ano yung second degree cousin, di ba? Dahil hindi mo naiintindihan yung family tree, hindi mo maiintindihan yung family code. Kaya pag-uusapan natin lahat yan, no? Isa yan sa mga gustong-gusto ko i-discuss sa inyo. Yan, parating tinatanong nyo yung paano ba yung annulment of marriage, di ba? Yan, ako, ang saya-saya niyan, no? Ako yung minsan natanong na nung isang judge sa Quezon City, Bisquera, bakit ba ang dami-daming gusto magpa-annul ng marriage? So, paano? Buntisan ang buntisan. Pagka nabuntis, gusto magpakasal, nakalimutan na yung kasal ang isa sa pinakasakit na ulo dyan magastos yan. Pakakainin mo yan, hindi mo naman kamag-anak. Pag hindi mo binila ng damit yan, kakaliwa pa yan. Yung pa judge, kumakaliwa yung lalaki, gaganti yung babae. Before you know it may kanya-kanya na sila. Gusto nang ipa-annul yung marriage. Pakakasalan na yung tunay na minahal. Yung mga ganun, judge ka ako. Sa awa naman ng Diyos, 12 yata kaming kaso noon, no? Kasama si Panelo, no? Kaupayan ni Panelo. Puro kami pinatalo ng judge. Ayaw mag-grant ng annulment of marriage. Yung for example, yung pinag-uusapan na attorney, madalas tanong sa akin, attorney, yung asawa ko mahigit na 7 taon na kaming hindi nagsasama pwede ko ba i-consider na yung marriage namin annulled na? In fact, 10 taon na. Nasaan yung asawa mo? Nandun sa kapitbahay, meron na ho siyang kinakasama doon. Ikaw, meron na rin ho. Di considered na kami na pwede na kami magpa-annul. Sabi 7 years lang. Ay, mali. Sabi ko, kailangan ka ako, hindi basta nakasunadaan yung maghihiwalay kayo. Hiwalay na kayo at pwede na kayo magsama ng ibang babae, ibang lalaki. Hindi ganun yun, no? Yung pag-uusapan natin, under the family code yun. No? Ang ganda-ganda. Yan civil law. Pagpunta pa ng pupunta pa tayo for example sa mercantile law, no? Commercial law. Yan, korporasyon. No? Meron na akong upload sa korporasyon pero madadagdagan pa yon. Pero for example, yung banking, ang dami-dami dyan. Yung anti-money laundering lang, tinatapos ko na yung materials ko nung ako'y pinag-lecture dyan sa harap ng mga judges, hindi pa naman ako ganong kilala nun. When I was introduced and I was taking over on a late basis, meaning late yung nauna sa aking nagsalita, so late din ako ng 1.5 hours, and that means kung 30 minutes na lang ako magsasasabi, mag-uuwi yung mga nakikinig judges sa akin. Siyempre, may usapan kung anong oras. Yung nauna sa akin, napakagaling. Si Justice Edelberto Sandoval, talagang expert yan sa criminal law. O pagbali-baligtad mo yung revised penal code, kabisado niya. Gwapo pa. Pagkatapos, magaling pa sa mga jokes. Anak ng weteng. Yung mga iba, puro jokes lang eh. Pero alam mo, pagka ang mga listeners ng mga judges, hindi puro jokes. Dapat talaga may substance. Pero pag napagod nakikinig, yun, kailangan may joke ka. Isipin mo yun na nauna sa akin. Pagkatapos ang topic ko anti-money laundering. At ng weteng sino nakakaintindi nun? Jadi malungkot na malungkot ako. Ako mas bata at mas hindi kasi sikat ni Justice Sandoval. So, nung ako'y pumanik, malungkot na ako kasi paano ko ma-discuss yung anti-money laundering 30 minutes na lang. So, sabi ko, pasensya ka na kayo kako. Naagawan ako ng oras. I have only 30 minutes. Pero kako, I promise you kako, if some of you will stay, sabi ko, for an extra 30 minutes, 1 hour, I will continue for as long as there is one listener here. Sabi ko. Tahimik sila sa loob nila. Malapit na kami layasan ka, kwento-kwento ka pa. Eto na ngayon. Nung banat ko ng anti-money laundering law, sabi ko, do you know that the anti-money laundering law started with Al Capone? And the reason why it was called laundering is because Al Capone, bought all of the laundry shops in California, sabi ko, in San Francisco, in order to use the laundry for purposes of depositing his illegal money. That's why it became anti-money laundering because he was really using the laundry shops. Biglang natunga nga yung mga judges. Hindi nila narinig yun. At hindi totoo, hindi na naisip na yung money laundering came from laundry itself, At nagsimula si Al Capone. Di tumahimik na sila. Di kinuwento ko na. Siyempre sinadya ko, nung hindi matatapos yung kwento ko ng 30 minutes, kinat ko. Sabi ko, I cannot finish my story about Al Capone because it's already 30 minutes and some of you may want to already go home. Aba, nagrevolusyon yung mga judges, sabi, Dean Bisquera, please continue. We don't want to go home. Biro mo ayaw umuwi. Inabot na kami ng 1 hour. Sabi ko, 1 hour na ako eh. Baka mamaya may 30 minutes pa tayo. No, tuloy. Yun, kinikwento ko na yung money laundering, paano ginagawa sa Swiss banks, paano yung mafia, ganun. Wala silang alam lahat doon in relation to money laundering. Aba, akalain mo, yung nagsimula ako ng magsalita ng mga 1:30, 3:30 na, wala pang tumatayo. At palakpakan, naintindi lang, yung pala yung story ng gusto nyo marinig yun? Ayun, i-upload ko yun sa YouTube. At ngayon lahat makakapanood, ano pala relasyon ng anti-money laundering na napakahirap intindi. Pag binabasa mo sa dyaryo, naririnig mo sa TV, nakikita mo sa social media, until sabihin mo, nagsimula yan kay Al Capone. Gusto nyo siguradong matutunan yun. Nako, ang dami pa ho tayong pag-uusapan. Very, very interesting po. Kaya, we will, pasensya na kayo, I'm on a catch-up mode, but I will have. So, marami pong salamat for allowing me again to be part of your, to be here as my audience. I always appreciate your watching my my uploads. Alam nyo, hindi pa ako pinasusweldo ng Google. Kasi ang sabi sa akin, pagka raw may advertisement, pinapatay niya raw advertisement. Wala naman nung ibabayad sa akin yung Google kung wala akong advertisement. Parang TV rin yan. Kaya kung sakali, pagtiyagaan nyo na lang, huwag nyo nang putulin yung advertisement. Para sa TV, doon na kayo pupunta sa CR pag may advertisement. Para naman meron ding ibayad sa akin. Wala pa akong bayad Nagsimula ako mga 9 months ago. Mabilis naman ang following. Ang dami na, May mga slides tayo, 7,000 ay nanunood, Hindi ko lang talunin yung mga babae na puro sex ang pinag-uusapan Anak ng weteng, hindi ko kaya yon. So, marami pong salamat. Thank you very much for your kindness. I love you all and I will continue to be your friend. Si Dean Joe-Santos, Balagtas Bisquera, University of Manila College of Law, and your friend. Thank you very much.